Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm assuming it's afternoon wherever you are. Welcome to the fourth session of Trauma and Untruth, Promises Broken in God's Name, a series of webinars examining systems of oppression in church and society. This series is presented by New Community Ministries, the Diocese of Los Angeles Multicultural Ministry, and Bishop Suffragan Diane Jardine groups. Today's program especially is sponsored by The Gathering in the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles and Episcopal Asian Supper Table from the Diocese of New York. Today's panel conversation will be featuring Jonathan Tran from Baylor University and Liz Lin from Progressive Asian American Christians. My name is Yein Kim, and I am one of the co-founder of The Gathering. I also serve as director at St. Albans Episcopal Church in Westwood, Los Angeles. And before I go into the details and logistics of the program today, I would like to welcome Bishop Diane Jardine. Bishop?
Thank you, Yein. I would love to add my welcome to you all on this important event today. You know, the seed which was planted and grew into this event started with the New Community, formerly known as Multicultural Ministry here in LA, with their leadership. And I'm humbled and honored to be part of this group of amazing leaders of our church. You see, the brutal caught on video murder of George Floyd, when that happened, the New Community leadership gathered together and we talked about the waves of feelings and the need to do something. And at that moment, the idea of a series of Zoom events around the doctrine of discovery, racial identity, and racial capitalism were born under the umbrella title of Traumas and Untruths, Promises Broken in God's Name. So what we know in today's work, partnering with The Gathering in East, which is a great joy, it represents the reality of racial capitalism and racial identity on the Asian community. We will be working in the weeks and months to come to offer in-depth dives into how racial capitalism affects the Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities as well. So on behalf of Bishop Taylor and Canon McCarthy, I welcome you all to this event, and I invite you to check out our other offerings from the New Community event on our diocesan webpage. And now I would love to invite my brother Bishop, Alan Shin, to offer his welcome.
Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Alan Shin. I'm the Bishop Suffragan in the Diocese of New York. And on behalf of East Episcopal Asian Supper Table in the Diocese of New York, I'd like to welcome every one of you and welcome our honored guests today, and also give thanks to this collaboration ministry with The Gathering of the Diocese LA. I hope that you participate from your heart in truth and in the spirit of respect and reconciliation. And I hope that conversation may be fruitful and passionate, that you may actually engage with one another in this very important topic of racial capital identity. Without further ado, I would like to invite you now to join me in the prayer. Let us pray. Holy God, you created us in your image in all its beautiful array of diversity, and promised us that you would never abandon us, even in the most difficult and challenging times. Help us remember your presence in these times of pandemic suffering and chaos, and find hope in the power of your love. Watch over those who are suffering and dying from COVID. from economic hardships, and from natural disasters like wildfires, hurricanes, and tropical storms of recent. Bless our conversations on the issues of race relations and racism, especially in the lives and the identity of Asian Americans. In the face of pain and suffering, help us be instruments of healing. In the face of fear and anger, give us courage to embrace peace and harmony. In the face of hatred and violence, create in us graceful and compassionate hearts. In the face of injustice and oppression, empower us to practice justice and mercy. In the face of division and untruth, strengthen us to stand up for truth and respect the dignity of our differences. In the face of dehumanization and racial brutality, teach us to respect the dignity of every human being. Help us repent of our sinful ways of racism and bigotry, and cleanse us from the evil of white supremacy, that we may learn to walk humbly with you and with one another in love, justice, and mercy, through Jesus Christ, crucified and risen, for the grace and truth of your love. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bishop. So today we will going to explore the topic on racial capitalism. Americans seem obsessed with racial identity. To belong here, it is thought is to have a racial identity, and to participate in anti-racism is to establish, secure, and assert one's racial identity against those who would threaten it. But what if racial identity, say establishing, securing, and asserting it, especially under the conditions of racial capitalism, only further entrenches us in unjust structures and systems? So today's conversation between two leading Asian American figures, Liz Lin. Liz is the co-founder of Progressive Asian American Christians and a senior fellow at New Begin House of Studies in San Francisco. And Jonathan Tran. Jonathan is George Bain's professor of religion at Baylor University. He's completing the book, Yellow Christianity, Intervening on Anti-Racist Thought. Jonathan and Lynn will get to the heart of a touchy subject and invite us to ask, racial identity at what cost? So again, I would like to mention that we have Spanish interpretation available. There are instructions as to how you can turn on that button on the bottom in the chat. And I'll just give you a brief overview of the schedule today. So we will go into a brief breakout session for about 5 minutes. You will get to introduce yourself and say how you got here. And we'll come back to the big group and we'll hear Jonathan and Liz talk for about 30 minutes. And then we'll go on to the second breakout sessions in the same room that you were introduced first. And then there you'll be asked to come up with a question that you would like to share with the whole group. After that, 15 minutes of breakout session, we'll come back to the panel conversation and Q&A session. So that's the overview of our schedule today, and the programs and all the links that we're mentioning throughout the day will be posted on chat. And when the time comes after the second breakout room sessions, you will be able to post your questions in the chat. And we will have the instructions available throughout. So please pay attention to the chat. And now we're going to head out to the first breakout room session. For those who are just joining us, we just came back from a very short breakout room, and there's a link to the program for today in the chat. So everyone's back, and now I will give the microphone to you, Liz and Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Yein. Welcome, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you, and Jonathan and I are grateful that you've chosen to spend part of your Saturday here. Just to give you an overview of our time today, we're going to talk first about racial capitalism and the racial capitalist critique of racial identity and the implications of that for Asian Americans. And then we're going to move into a discussion about whiteness and the usefulness of whiteness as a concept, particularly as it relates to anti-racism efforts. And then Jonathan and I will pause and we'll return to our breakout groups to discuss. And then we'll come back as a large group to talk about the value and costs of racial identity when it comes to solidarity and coalition building before opening up for some Q&A. Jonathan, want to take it away?
Yeah, and I join Liz in thanking the Episcopal Church in hosting this, what we consider to be a really vitally important question, and welcome to our friends from across the country. And I'm certainly glad to be here with my good friend Liz Lin. So I'm just going to jump right into it. If you look at race and racism from the perspective of thinking of those as functions of racial capitalism, racial identity is particularly a problem. It's not something that can be easily assumed without inheriting a fair number of conceptual and practical problems, right? And so let's say on any given day, for those of us who identify or are identified as Asian American, we just assume Asian American identities, or it's assumed of us. That is, we wake up in the morning, we interact with others, they see us as Asian Americans. The Asian American identity gives a standing or a sense of belonging in the world. Sometimes we even officially check little boxes that say Asian American. We read Asian American literature or we don't, and we differentiate ourselves according to those kinds of things. But if you think about race and racism from the perspective of racial capitalism, then this suddenly becomes a kind of problem, that assuming these things don't happen as comfortably as we want them to, right? So what racial capitalism was a mode of political economic life that keyed exploitation to racial identity. That is, it utilized racial identity to justify exploitation. And the exploitation, right, whether it meant turning people into property, distinguishing between different kinds of labor, different types of domination. We did these things which were obviously morally problematic, and we put the title of race on a person to make ourselves feel better about it, right? In other words, racial identity has a justificatory role. It justifies behavior or actions that is otherwise morally offensive or objectionable, right? And this started happening at the very foundations of this country. It's not like this is new. This is, in a sense, been about 200 years in the making. In the beginning, the late 1700s, we devised between different kinds of labor based on race. In Europe, they thought of different kinds of labor, say Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, the Irish versus the English in terms of race. And of course, in enslaved persons, we distinguished people, we defined people as Black, African, and that justified what we did to enslaved persons. And certainly the story of Asian Americans is very much internal to this story. That is, as Asians began to come to America in the 19th century, the term Asian, or whatever label we gave to them, yellow peril, racialized them in a way that justified the process of exploitation and domination. Now, downstream from that history, we've largely inherited a world built around that. And I think we would like to believe that somehow we can reverse engineer the concepts, that racial identity can become something other than exploitation and domination. Given that they were structured in this way and have gone on for so long, it's really hard to do this, right? So here's an easy example. So in most of the cities where you live, it doesn't matter where you live in the country, Black and brown people live in parts of our cities that are often without the basic resources of access to healthcare, good education, employment. But when we look at these folks and we see that they're Black and brown, somehow that justifies the reality for us. Somehow it says that's less important, that's less bothersome, right? That's how racial capitalism works. It's a mode of exploitation that uses a person's racial identity, in a sense, to smooth over the exploitation, inequality, injustice. And Asian Americans are very much embedded within this world, right? So we would like to reverse engineer Asian American identity to not be exploited or dominated. But when you think about the structures that say compartmentalize our life, confine our lives, put us in straitjackets, things like the model minority myth, the black-white binary, right? The way anti-racist discourse marginalizes us when we're already marginalized by racism. Those are not accidental features of race language. Those are intrinsic features, right? They're necessary parts of what race thinking comes to. So really what Liz and I are trying to do is think through this question, given that broader critique from the perspective of racial capitalism, right? What can racial identity amount to? Again, not something that we often choose into, but very often is chosen for us. Can we get out of the kind of confines that was built in from the very beginning and has gone on for a couple hundred years now? Now, Liz, you think about this a lot, right? Because you founded Progressive Asian American Christians. You identify as an Asian American woman in America in all these racialized contexts. How do you think about these questions? And especially because you're well aware of these critiques.
Yeah, I appreciate everything you've just said. I appreciate this analysis. And I especially appreciate the connection that you make clear between the origins of race and economic exploitation. I've heard Brian Stevenson say in the past that there's always an economic rationale to defend oppression, always. And that shaped a lot of my thoughts about structural racism and the best ways to dismantle it. And I appreciate how your thoughts about racial capitalism kind of put some flesh onto those bones. So conceptually, I agree with everything that you've just said, right? Like race is a social construct that was developed for the purpose of exploitation. It's not particularly descriptive for anyone when there's so much variance within groups as opposed to between groups. But my concern is that racial identity is not a matter of individual choice, as you've alluded to. It does not really matter if I personally identify as Asian American when society identifies me as Asian American and treats me accordingly. So I think about growing up in the Midwest in the 80s and 90s and wanting very desperately at the time not to be seen as Asian, to be seen as white instead, and learning the hard way that I did not really have a choice in the matter. So while I agree with your critique in theory, the reality is that we live in a society that's already been so thoroughly racialized by our history. And so I'm curious about how you reconcile your theoretical critique about race and how we choose or to identify racially with the realities of the racial constructs that our history has given us.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions we haven't really come to terms in terms of, for those of us who are committed to thinking through or activism in terms of anti-racism, is that we haven't really seriously asked the question, what does racism do? What is it for, right? If it is, for the most part in our society at this point, generally accepted that racism is a bad idea, that it's morally unacceptable, why does it persist? Why does it seem almost permanent? In some sense, gathering steam in this season. And this is kind of what I'm worried about, right? That what racial identity does is it exploits exploitation, structures and systems that we've all grown used to, right? And part of the reason we don't want to get rid of the racism is because we're beneficiaries of it. So on the one hand, it's totally the case that it's imposed on us, but in some sense, we choose into those identities partly because we're beneficiaries of them. And this is where there's a particular rub for Asian Americans, right? Because it's certainly the case that racial identity has very much been imposed upon us and hurt us and wounded us and confined us. But there are other ways in which that identity enables us to be beneficiaries of that system. Even in our best anti-racist efforts, I worry that Asian Americans haven't come to terms with this history and its structuring relationship. So maybe the best way to say it, Liz, is if everyone who assumed the Asian American racial identity, talked about it the way you do, I think we'd be better off. My guess is that many Asian Americans don't. Like, they don't think of themselves, they don't hold both things in hand. I'm Asian American and I'm racialized as Asian American. I think they take the first and just go with it. In other words, they hold the Asian American identity, even if it's imposed upon them, in a maybe simplistic or untroubled manner, as if it just enables versus at the same time disabling.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You mentioned that one of the reasons why we haven't made enough of an effort to dismantle racism when we know that it's abhorrent is because we are beneficiaries of the system in some way. Can you flesh that out a little bit? Are you talking about us specifically as Asian Americans? Are you talking about society? Like, who is the we that is benefiting from the system?
Yeah, and that's part of the difficulty, right? I mean, as you kind of said, its explanatory power is so limited, but it's almost as if we presume the explanatory power tells us something. I mean, the reality is when we talk about Asian Americans, we're talking about a massive set of realities. So if it's some kind of reference back to Asia, Asia itself is a massive set of realities distinguishable by any number of national, linguistic, cultural, ethnic realities, right? So that's part of the problem. But what I mean is, I think for a lot of Asian Americans, the assumption of Asian American identity, as problematic it is fueled by this desire to live on the right side of, say, racialized life in America, right? And this is certainly not true if you drill down on the numbers of what counts as Asian American, right? And if you distinguish, say, East Asians from Southeast Asians or various forms of Southeast Asians, this begins to break down. But there is a sense that claiming Asian American identity does come with political power. It does come with clout. And as well, it also puts us on the other side of commodifying structures, right? This is, in a sense, it approximates us to forms of power, access to power that, in a sense, privileges us. And my worry then is when we assume that identity, we don't often acknowledge that, right? So, you know, I think there's plenty of examples here in terms of how this actually works for us, right? So to be identified as Asian American is, in a sense, to not be identified as other kinds of racial minorities. It also allows us to then not be identified with, say, white folks or whiteness, as people like to talk about, right? But it's also the case when you track out the history in terms of housing, education, for a good number of Asian Americans, certainly not all, the Asian American identity allows us to land on the right side of those things. And again, it's the assumption of the identity without the recognition of those problems. And again, the recognition of both problems, the commodifying realities against us and the ways in which we commodify other people. I mean, have you thought about this question a lot, I imagine, a lot in terms of your thinking through these realities?
Yeah, I guess I enter it from it's interesting to hear you talk about like that, because I think about like the very term Asian American, right? It's a relatively recent invention. It was coined in the late 60s by Cal grad students who wanted a name to increase the visibility of activists with Asian heritage because they knew that we had more political power as one coalition than we did as a bunch of different ethnic groups, right? And their use of the term implied solidarity with the Black Power movement, with the American Indian movement. It implied solidarity with all of these liberation movements that were happening in the late 60s and into the 70s, right? And there was this demographic element for sure, but the term was primarily a political identification. And so I feel like when I come at the term of Asian American, I do see it as a way of increasing our political power, as you said. I totally am tracking with you there. But I see it as a way of increasing and elevating our ability to identify with other oppressed communities. And it seems like your understanding is maybe a slightly different take on what it does for our political power, that maybe it enables us to align more with the status quo. Is that what I'm hearing from you? Like,
Or it allows us to not ask the questions, right? I mean, I think that's exactly right. In the 60s or 70s, when the term was coined, it was coined within coalitional realities.
Yes.
I mean, we've seen since the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, an intensification of politics almost entirely aligned with identity and identity as differentiated from one another. Mm-hmm. So when we thought about Asian American politics in the 60s and 70s, that seems a far cry from what we mean today, right? And oftentimes it's not thought in terms of coalitional terms. It's thought in terms of enfranchisement, personal identity, licensing certain kinds of lifestyles. So yeah, so if that's what I mean by if people thought about in your terms, that is, this is a racialized identity I inherit, but it's also one I can assume for politically important pragmatic reasons, coalitional practices, anti-racism. That's all well and good, but something else has happened, right? Racial identity has become increasingly, to use a technical term, naturalized, as if that's just a given about who I am. Again, that's assumed on me, but that givenness is what worries me, because we don't then examine the history of what we're stepping into, nor do we ask the question, what can I properly do with this identity? I think we step into a narrative. And in the worst cases, as you know, this becomes biologized, right? We think that this actually names something essential about us, rather than, as I think you're very rightly pointing to, a pragmatic political identity. It names, we think it maps on naturally into terms of questions of ethnicity, language, history, immigration. And it sometimes does. My thought is those kinds of connections work as often as they don't work. But we hang on the parts that work, ignore the parts that don't work, right? This is racial identity. It's always doing things to us and we're doing things with it. But I think we're too comfortable with the things that we think it does for us.
Okay. So I guess in light of that critique, like, is there an alternative that you think is viable? You know what I mean? Like, in the current reality that we live in, we have been handed these constructs, you know, built over centuries of history and oppression, right? Like, is there a different way for us to identify? Is there a different way for us to engage with our racial identity? Like, how do you envision this being better than the way that it currently exists?
Yeah, this is in a sense is the $1 million question. How do we both name the history that we've been that's been imposed on us, that also that we inherit and inhabit, recognize the problem and going forward? Well, one answer we know that can't be the answer is post-racialism or some of the nutty thinking around colorblindness. We can't do that because we ironically have to keep the race concepts on the table to track the reality and consequences of racialization. So I'm definitely not for post-racialism. I would be interested in something called deracialization.
Okay.
And I think this is where keeping track of, say, the power of white racial identity comes into play, right? So I'm interested in how you think about white racial identity, because when we call people white, we don't want to make the essentializing move, because that's what the original white supremacists did, right? They claimed an essential move about them over and against, say, black folks, brown folks, yellow folks, et cetera, et cetera. But where is the role of talking about white folks at this point? And I ask you, especially with all the rage about talking about whiteness and white fragility, what, you know, given that we agree with the kind of problems of racial identity, where is it helpful for you in terms of talking about whiteness and white folks and this kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with this too, for exactly the reason that you said, that like it has all of the same problems of racial identity that we've been talking about, right? It's not particularly descriptive. It's not, there's no essential element here. There's so much more variation within whiteness than there is between white people and people of color. And the term erases a lot of these differences, right? And I have met like plenty of people who like resist being identified as white because they identify more with their like religious or ethnic traditions. But for all of these flaws, I still feel like the term is useful and even necessary for the reason that you said, which is that without it, we can't talk meaningfully about power. Because I think about organizations like InterVarsity that made the decision decades ago to commit to the language of ethnicity instead of race. And we can see clearly now how problematic that is, because you can't track the tangible effects of racism and privilege and power at the level of ethnicity, right? These disparities are racialized. And for that reason, we can't throw away the language of whiteness, as problematic as it is. But I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And yet I worry about how much we're talking about whiteness these days, right? I mean, it's terribly ironic in a time when we're trying to give voice to those who have been marginalized, wounded, worse. We spend a lot of time talking about whiteness. And it seems like maybe one reason is, I think maybe two kinds of older thinking. One if we can just get white people to like us, to accept us, to believe in our humanity, then maybe they'll turn the corner, right? Or another mode of that is if we get white people to feel bad enough about themselves, then maybe finally they'll let go of those structures and systems that privilege and benefit them. At this point, I'm wondering whether that strategy works in a significant way, or whether it just kind of produces a kind of sentimentality on the part of white folks. In some sense, I'd be interested in seeing if we can press the question of just systems and structures, regardless of whether white people feel good about us or not, or feel bad about themselves. In some sense, I wonder about structures and systems that might even be people-proof, right? That is, they hone in on obvious disparities in housing, education, but in a sense, they leave behind, what the white person feels. It just feels kind of odd to me that we focus so much on whiteness at this point, or white people, especially given what you said. It's unclear what exactly it names for us.
Yeah, I guess my question is like, is it possible to get to the point of addressing structures and systems without white sentimentality, right? Because it's hard for me to envision a society in which white people still hold all the levers of power and have them address, these huge disparities in things like wealth and housing and education and on without getting them to feel something, you know what I mean? So, I mean, I don't think white guilt and white benevolence are like bad in and of themselves. Like, I do think that white people should be aware of the benefits that they enjoy in our society, which I think is what triggers the guilt. And I think that it is good for them to view people of color beneficially as opposed to negatively. But like, I think the problem that you've identified is that like white guilt and benevolence do not lead to meaningful policy change or the relinquishing of personal power. So at least we have not seen many tangible examples of that. So I guess what I'm wondering is there a way to get to those things without first engaging white guilt and white benevolence, which, as you've said, has not proven super effective so far?
Right, because what is the connection points between the guilt and the sentimentality? Like, does the white administrator take the guilt or sentimentality and then push policy that's not only going to undercut their own benefits and privileges, but those of other white folks?
Yeah.
And this is where I think the racial capitalist framing helps, because it both identifies what the racial identity is doing or not doing, but it also understands that we're talking about structures and systems of massive inequality that particularly disproportionately and devastatingly target, identify, utilize, manipulate, dominate, exploit people of color. And so in this sense, if you take the racial capitalist framing, then you become less concerned about people's feeling a certain way or another. You look at the disparities and you ask the question, what needs to change, right? So when we have a system where 23, 26 of the richest, mostly dudes in the world, own 50% of the world's wealth, that's the kind of thing that even if we don't key in on, say, the white mentality, we can say that there's just something obviously wrong about that, especially when we drill down further and we see the 50% of the world that they own look a lot different than they do, right? Have been racialized in a way that makes us feel not that bad about it. Or if we look at income inequality or the way the housing market works in terms of inherited wealth versus those who have never been given access to housing at all. Those are the kinds of things I wonder if we focus too much on racial identity. We should have been asking what racial identity was doing to facilitate those processes, and then ask what are the ways that we can attack the structures, right? So the racial capitalist thing is the use of racial identity to justify exploitation. Then anti-racism, key to this reality, would do two things. One, it would break down the racialization's ability to obscure vis-a-vis justification, and then it would attack the systems of exploitation. My worry is that our consistent interest in just the first is going to, persistently distract us from the whole system that we're in. And that's the great irony, is that we'll be talking about racial identity all the while benefiting from the privileges of exploitation. And that this will become a massive distraction within the way we think about, race, political economy, these kinds of realities.
Yeah. I really like the idea in theory of attacking, like, instead of, trying to do all this work to engage sentimentality, like let's let's go and let's look at the actual structures and the disparities. But like, I think for me is in practice, it's impossible to take apart those systems without evoking great emotion, right? I think about that a lot as a parent that has children in public schools now, and listening to all the white parents around me talk about how much they care about public education and equity, while also pulling their kids from public school and sending them to private school, you know? And so I just have a difficult time imagining how we take apart those structures without in any way, like while bypassing that emotional thing, when the very act of doing so is going to elicit emotion, you know? And I'm wondering if you've thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question. And I think it has to do with this question of what do we think the process of politics is, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we've thought about it. And in other words, maybe the answer to the question is, that seems very right. I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. Okay. But on the flip side, I want to say, I don't know if we can continue to talk about race as much as we do and think we can get out of it, right? So think about, for a second, two kinds of conceptual straitjackets on Asian American life: the model minority myth and the black-white binary. Mm-hmm. I think those of us who have been involved in forms of activism or theory, anti-racist activism or theory, we keep on thinking these are accidental features of talking about race. And maybe we think if we talk about race even more, right, Asians will find a place somewhere in the binary. Or if we talk about Asian Americans even more, right, then somehow we won't be straitjacketed by the model minority myth. But I think those things are very clearly effects of talking racially at all. In America, right, the substance of race is black and white. And I think we keep on thinking we can expand that, maybe find a place in, but then we keep on butting our heads up against the binary. The same with the model minority myth. We keep on saying disaggregate the numbers, talk about us with greater clarity to specificity, right? Greater attention to difference. But this is to fail to understand that race is not about difference. It's about differentiation. It's not about diversity. It's about stratification. Right? These are the structures. That's why we invented this stuff. That's why it continues to benefit us as a society. And so to me, the question is, what you're saying is undeniably right, right? How do we attend to that reality while also coming to the recognition of the extreme limits and I think significant costs of thinking racially, right? I think of you racially as an Asian American. You relate to me racially as an Asian American. I relate to my white friends as white, and with that, while trying to dance around, well, that's not an essential category. And I just don't know that race language is flexible, or at least it wasn't meant to be flexible in those kinds of ways. Mm-hmm. So the practical questions you're raising, I think, come to a question like, the system that we have is so powerful, so inveterate, so stubborn, that it delimits even the consideration of alternatives. Right, and that to me is the nature of capital. That's the nature of domination and exploitation. So what I want to think is that your practical questions, I hope that what they do is they open this up to different kinds of avenues of thought.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious then, like, you know, you're raising this question of, we talk like, if the process of talking more about race is not actually getting us any further in terms of moving outside of like the black-white binary and moving outside of the model minority myth, like what framework do you propose as the alternative?
Right. Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying the more we talk about that stuff, the more we reify whiteness and blackness, right? Mm-hmm. Or more specifically, whiteness and anti-blackness. The more we talk about Asian American, it's like we can't dismantle the model minority myth without somehow at the same time reaffirming it, right? And we keep on going in circles about this. It's because I think we begin with racial identity, we live into it without ever stepping outside of it. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe one of the ways that we began to think about is something you flagged earlier, right? What if we thought about racial identity as simply a pragmatic affair, right? Mm-hmm. It's simply a political reality, right? So let me give you an example. Noel Ignatieff wrote the book, How the Irish Became White. Mm-hmm. He did not write the book to re-essentialize white identity. Mm-hmm. He wrote the book to show how unessential it was.
Right.
what he said, J. Caspian Kang did an interview with him on his deathbed, and what he said is, amazingly, the book has been used to do just the opposite, to reify white identity. And I'm afraid that we Asian Americans are doing the same thing. Rather than using the category to destabilize itself, right? To visit a history that understands its modes of oppression, somehow we've lived further into it, giving it a solidity that it was never meant to have. So my guess is to return us to those moments where we thought, well, racial identity is a pragmatic political identity aimed at dismantling modes of oppression. We assume the identity only for that reason, but we don't pretend it says more to us than that. The difficult question you're pressing, though, is how do we do that while also recognizing the incredible benefits it bestows to us, the ways it does give us standing, right? The ways that our affective lives are connected, importantly, to it. And this becomes really difficult, right? So, sorry. So that may have been assigned to transition. So Liz and I have, this is a question for the breakout session. Liz and I have obviously put a lot on the table in terms of questions about the benefits of racial identity, but we've also tried to recognize racial identity, as Liz said, isn't something we necessarily choose. It's imposed upon us. It's not simply like a set of options. It's more like a fact of life. So how do we both acknowledge, say, the benefits and costs of racial identity and live in a way that acknowledges, right, and makes us aware of the potential harms, but also helps us to kind of make good use of it? In a sense, this is Liz's question at the end. So think as groups, what are the harms of racial identity, but what are the ways we can work through those harms and deploy the identity for good? And then as a group, maybe pose a question to the rest of, for all of us. And we'll try to post those and then interact around those questions in the session later on.
Thank you, Jonathan and Liz. Liz, sorry. There is a question posted in the chat from Yun Jung. We're going to go into the breakout session. The same one as you were before. Liz and Jonathan raised hard questions about the usefulness of racial identity, especially for Asian American context. At the same time, they show that in America, racial identity is not so much a choice, but an unavoidable fact of life. So how do we live into racial identity in ways that benefit rather than harm us? In discussing this also, what question does your group want to pose to the whole group today and to the panelists? The chat for your question submission will be open once you come back, and please be mindful of every participant in the group so everyone has a chance to respond and talk. Have fun at the breakout group, and I will see you again soon.
Thanks, Yein.
Welcome back. I hope you had a good breakout room session. Please write your questions either to me, Yein Kim, or Nathaniel Lee, and we will be able to assemble it and ask to the panelists afterwards. And please also choose language when you are asked. So yes, please pose a question that came out of your room. The chat's enabled right now. And as we do that and assemble the questions, I will once give it back to you, Jonathan and Liz.
All right, thank you so much, Yein. So we've been talking about the values and costs of racial identity, and we'd like to talk about how it plays out in efforts to build solidarity and coalitions. So we mentioned earlier that the term Asian American was created as a way to increase our visibility when it came to activism, particularly when it came to solidarity with other liberation movements. And I'm curious, Jonathan, if you think that the term has fulfilled its intended purpose, or if you think the outcome has been more complicated than that.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, unfortunately, more complicated, right? So I think when we Asian Americans imagine ourselves in solidarity with, say, other folks of color, I think we think that racism is a kind of multi-team sport, right? That we're all equal partners in a kind of reality. Race in America, race was created to make a distinction between indentured white workers and permanent property Black folks. And so it's structured as a Black-white thing. So then when we have this idea of kind of coming into a coalitional relationship with other folks, it's almost necessarily the case that we're sidelined in that conversation. And this comes as a surprise to us because it's hurtful, it's wounding. It's hurtful to hear that people are surprised that we've ever experienced racism, that we've also been on the outside of these stories. I think this summer was a pretty amazing reality. On the one hand, you had a moment of tremendous racial reckoning, rightly so, around the continual killing of Black people by white police officers. At the same time, you had brewing extreme racism, explicit racism directed against thousands of Asian Americans. But the stories seemed to go completely disconnected from each other. The nation's attention was rightly fixed on the plight of African Americans, but the story about Asian Americans was cast to the side. That's the larger reality in which we try to have coalitional life with others. And again, the concern is, what if the way we are living into our racial realities, not just Asian Americans, but all of us, actually create those fissures, in a sense, makes it the case that we're, right, as I said earlier, that even in our anti-racism, it's actually the anti-racism that's further marginalized those who have been already marginalized by racism, which is the way I described Asian Americans earlier. I mean, I want to ask you the same kind of question. What are your hopes, especially with your kind of activism work, your work with PAC? Where are you hopeful in this question? What are your big concerns around questions of coalitional solidarity?
I think it sounds like I am more optimistic about it than you are, perhaps. I have found that I found the term to be incredibly useful in terms of building coalition, not just politically, but also in terms of like common and shared experiences around being people that are part of a diaspora. And I have found a lot of like, not just political solidarity, but also like a sense of real personal belonging in that space. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on if that is like positive, negative, or neutral, the sense of, or how you feel like the sense of belonging fits into this whole landscape that we're talking about. And I feel like I have seen, I experience a real magnification of our voices when we operate collectively in a political way than we do individually. So I feel like in terms of intra-Asian solidarity and coalition building, I feel very positively about the term. In terms of where it places us in terms of solidarity with other liberation movements, I think I have had a range of experiences around that, but I feel like more than anything, I feel like the label has been helpful for me to give me a place as I start my journey of learning what it looks like to journey with other communities of color and understanding how our struggles are all connected. So I don't know that I have necessarily, I feel like a lot of times this like, where we fit in with other communities of color gets into this weird, like, we're all fighting over this like tiny piece of the puzzle and like, where's our piece and when do we get our piece? But I feel like I have found, instead of thinking about it that way, I have found the term to be a helpful way to enter in this understanding of like how all of our struggles are connected and all of our liberations are connected, if that makes sense.
Well, can you say some more about some of the experiences that kind of coming alongside or others coming alongside you and how you could help us think in non-competitive terms, right? Because I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about it. Because if part of what race was right, especially within its capitalist framework, is to introduce forms of competition, right? White indentured workers versus Black, quote, property. In other words, if there's part of the problem was the competitive nature of it in the first place, what are the ways, help us here, what are the ways we could do this without thinking competitively? And what have you been in your experiences where you've seen folks come alongside Asian Americans come alongside others in these kind of really powerful coalitional ways?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously all of my experiences are completely just that. They're just my experiences, so I can't speak for everybody. But I have found that in the spaces that I've been in with other like communities of color, that people have actually been very much advocating for Asian Americans and have like been quick to call out the garbage, especially in terms of like racist language from this administration around COVID and acts of violence against Asian Americans and the ways in which Asian businesses have taken this huge financial hit. Like a lot of those conversations are being led by Black people in our communities, which I really, in my community at least, which I really appreciate. And to your point about like, sometimes they don't know about our own experiences of racism, I completely agree with that. And yes, it's hurtful, but there's also so much about their experiences that I am unaware of as an Asian American person. So I feel like I could be upset about it, sure, but then I could also see this as an opportunity for like mutual understanding and mutual education and like mutual support, you know what I mean? And like ways of, we have opportunities to find ourselves and to find the common threads in each other's stories. And yeah, I feel like I have felt like embracing the Asian American label has again given me a place in which to enter these conversations, because absent that, I don't know how I enter the conversation. Maybe I don't have the imagination because this is the landscape that we live in, but if I were to take that label off and try to enter the conversation, I don't know that where I land anymore, right? Because I'm certainly not white and I'm also not Black. So I don't know that, I don't see the benefit that removing the label would offer me in that situation. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm doubtful that we can remove it, but I want to attach, maybe I don't want to remove it, I want to attach something to it.
Okay.
That is, I want to attach the addendum, racialized as. So it names the experience, but it also names a posture, right? It names the experience of a nation that indexes people for domaination. Uses racial categories to dominate, to identify, to categorize, to separate, to pit against. But it also says this is something I'm as much as an active agency as anything else, trying to claim. But if you were to say, you know, what are you? And I would say, well, I'm racialized as Asian American. At least that maybe introduces a stopgap into what we think we're doing. Versus if it's I am Asian American, right? The term sounds like it's an essential claim about me. There's an identity out there, and then I have to choose it. I mean, you know, or I've claimed it in an essential or a deep way or something like that. But going back to the coalitional thing, I think that will help introduce. I think that actually opens up lines. Because my worry at this point is with the strong essential character that race has, it just exercises a kind of gravity that says, this is who you are, right? You can think about this, especially in the experience for folks from Asia, right? In Asia, difference is negotiated in any number of ways. Language, ethnicity, one's surname, right? One's name, culture, religion, class. But for some reason in America, race exerts such incredible gravitational force that all of our identity is subsumed into that. So it's formally made racial, and then the substance of race is Black and white. And then it's hard then to find standing. The worry with coalitional realities is if I say my identity is Asian American, does that already forfeit my participation in certain kinds of struggles? Well, you know, you've talked about experiences where being an Asian American gets you access in, introduces you and welcomes you into a place. I can imagine that going that way, as well as I can imagine people thinking, this is not an Asian American struggle, or this, you don't quite belong in this. And I can imagine Asian Americans, us doing the same kind of thing towards others. I think one benefit to the racial capital framework is, right, it again puts, it cautions us about racial identity, but it also names a source of oppression, right, that racial identity uses. And it's that ability to say, right, there's a lot of people who are being economically dominated. There's a lot of people that live under the complete crush of political economic realities of racial capitalism. And a lot of them have been racialized this way, and a lot of them have been racialized that, but the common reality is that oppression. And I wonder if that actually can open up. In that, I think what you're talking about is in that then we begin to share common stories, right? I'm not racialized as an African-American man, obviously. I am racialized as an Asian American man, but we can find common cause in the midst of those different stories and tracing the underlying exploitations, dominations, oppressions. So that's a way of naming the differences of oppression, but also coming under a kind of coalitional politics, right? But you know, just to go back to something you said earlier, I think the reason I tend to be more skeptical or worried about the promise of coalitional life is just frankly, I haven't seen a lot of it. And this is clearly, you know, as you said, your experience is yours. It's anecdotal, right? When I enter into race conversations on my campus, right, it's very clearly black and white. And there's no one advocating for Asian Americans, right? And I don't think that, I'm not saying something unique about Baylor. I think that's the race conversation in a lot of America. Another practical example is in terms of media coverage, right? When New Yorkers were experiencing severe rates of unemployment because of COVID, very little attention was given to a large percentage of that was Asian American restaurant workers, right? Whereas the presumption was it's only, you know, it's a black and white issue, right? And so, my anecdotal experience, which is admittedly limited, has suggested to me that, you know, we are marginalized by anti-racism. Now, what I'm trying to do is what I think you're encouraging is how do you both acknowledge that without introducing a kind of competitive relationship that just reinforces the same old problem? And there, I'm not quite sure. I think you kind of paint a way for us. But I wonder what kind of coalitional life looks like with, you know, with folks who have been racialized differently. So, what about coalitional life with those who are racialized as white? You know, one of the big debates, kind of hot spots in recent years is people, and I think rightly so, being worried that a lot of Black Lives Matters movement is headed up by white folks. So what do we do with that? Do we celebrate the coalitional realities there? Do we worry that what's happening in that dynamic as white people are taking over? And this is certainly the same with, say, coalitional life with Asian Americans. And how do we imagine the presence of white folks in our communities, especially ones who espouse to anti-racism, who are there to support us? But then I think some Asian Americans are worried of having folks like that in spaces. They're worried that they might take over or undermine or not relinquish authority or power. How do you think about that question?
That's really interesting. I have not had I have, at least in my own read, like it does not appear to me that a lot of BLM is run by white people. I certainly can think of examples of white people who are profiting off of what BLM has started and anti-racism education and literature. But in my experience, those are still predominantly, like almost entirely Black-led. And that is also my read on Asian American activist spaces as well. I feel like this thought about coalitional life with white people is super interesting to me, because I feel like the fact that we don't fit into the binary actually gives us an interesting entry point into this conversation, where I think because we do not clearly land, at least visibly, on either side of that, we have an opportunity to be like educators and allies in a way that is like non-threatening, if that makes sense. Like I have found that some of my white colleagues will receive things about racism, education. They will receive education about racism far more readily from me than they will from my Black colleagues. So I feel like this is one of the opportunities that not fitting into the binary offers us, that we have an opportunity to serve as allies and advocates in spaces where other communities of color may not be welcome. So I see an opportunity in this. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the opportunity here is, insofar as we don't fit, it's the suggestion that the primary discourse is broken. So instead of thinking, well, the discourse is great, but it's unfortunately narrowly black and white, so let's just try to broaden the discourse.
Sure.
Broaden the politics. I want to say that the very presence of Latinx communities, Asian American communities that persistently are not seen as fitting, puts enormous pressure on the thing. It should destabilize the conversation and open it up. I don't know that that's always what happens. I think more likely we're going to try to find our place into it and then take the place that we're given. But what I want to hope is the increasing, attention to these other communities will say that there's something wrong with the primary conversation. And we can't, it's not going to be as simple as, well, I'm going to talk about black and white here because that's what I'm used to doing, but I hope to include others. I'm hoping that the awareness that others aren't included in that conversation suggests something about the conversation.
Right.
I hope it can exert that kind of pressure. I mean, I hope that's part of what we're doing today is to signal what's happening here and what's happening here in relationship to what I think is not only a dominant conversation, but almost an orthodox conversation about race, right? That it seems to go on in some large measure in the public, and this is not in those coalitional spaces, but in the broader public, as if we haven't been part of the story for, going on, what, 170 years? So, but I don't know that that's the case. That may be too hopeful, too idealistic. Of how the broader conversation will go. I mean, what do you think in terms of, I mean, you're not speaking for PAC, but PAC is a very significant Asian American voice in the country right now. And you guys host a kind of very prolific kind of conversation. What are you seeing there in terms of the things that give you hope and that show promise?
I mean, I see a lot of hope and promise for the term Asian American, honestly. And I see a lot of people from different cultures and communities, acknowledging that the term and all the terms that we use around it in terms of, the term itself is hugely problematic too, but acknowledging all of our differences and the diversity in our stories and struggling to figure out what it means for us to live collectively and also to yield or to to exert our political power. So this is honestly the first pan or inter-ethnic Asian space I've ever been a part of, and it requires a lot of humility, and it requires an openness to learning constantly, but it gives me a lot of hope for the future of what coalition building can be.
Yeah, I wonder if we could think about Asian American identity that way, right? That is, we don't begin with an Asian American identity, rather we discover it, right? And we discover it in the context of the kind of politics that are liberative in action. In other words, I don't begin with an essential category, description of who I am as an Asian American. It's rather one I discover with others who are so similarly racialized, and then more broadly still with others who are racialized differently. And the sight lines are both in terms of the oppressions that we share and that we often share in terms of participating in. But then the second sight line is with our others, right? Other Asian Americans, others who are not racialized as Asian Americans. And then we begin to figure out and I think this is what we were both talking about earlier in terms of a pragmatic racial identity. It acknowledges the limitations, but it tries to hook on to the promise. Doing both seems to be critical to me at this point. And if anything, if we've done nothing else other than to both show the ways that there's problems and to show the promise, I think we've made some headway.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan and Liz. It was great just listening to you. I could listen to you for days, but unfortunately, we don't have unlimited time, and we have received a lot of great questions, and we are assembling them on a separate sheet. And now I will invite Nathaniel Lee from the Diocese of New York to ask some of those questions. Hopefully, we will get to ask as many questions as possible. So we will move on. There was a little bit of confusion for the Spanish translation. The interpreters were speaking at the same time, I think. So there was a question regarding that. I hope that it was solved. So now I will invite Nate for the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks everybody. It's good to be here today. Jonathan and Liz, thanks so much for all you've had to study. You've given us a lot to think about. So, and speaking of, there's a lot of questions here. I'll try to consolidate some of them. There's a few questions that kind of dig into this last point you're on about the usefulness of Asian American identity, or the term Asian American. And some of them center around generational realities, or like the ethnic realities within Asian American, like the sort of differences that get elided when we say Asian American. And specifically that, you know, I know as a Korean American, my grandmother would not really appreciate the term Asian American if that meant that it lumped her in with Japanese Americans, for whom she's not very excited about. So, I mean, can you guys tease that out a little bit? How do the generational realities map onto this discussion? And, you know, what problems does that raise for this discussion? How does that, you know, put us in a different place than maybe the black-white binary, that discussion? And then as we're thinking about building coalitions, different kinds of, you know, forms of intimacy and belonging, how do we do that when those are still parts of, in the Episcopal Church, we have like very different sorts of groups that get together from like our previous generations and our current generation. So how do you help us meet that out?
You want to go, Liz? You want to start? Yeah, I mean, I think that thanks for sharing that kind of personal anecdotal angle. Yeah, I think that's part of some of the questions I have. How do we both name what Asian American as a lived identity gives us, while also flagging those difficulties, and without just assuming the benefits should just let us pass over the difficulties, right? And so, so your grandma's experience of being Asian American, and I'm assuming your Korean American grandmother not wanting to be lumped in with Japanese Americans, which, you know, has its own, of course, history, intensely fraught history. So how do you think about that? And that's why I wonder if Asian American is sophisticated enough, subtle enough, does enough of the kind of fine detailed work necessary for our modes of identification with one another, without riding roughshod over histories that are very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly tall order, right? To ask people who descend from groups that have had hundreds of years of conflict with each other, some of which very violent and very oppressive, to fall under one umbrella. That's an incredibly big ask. Yeah. And at the same time, I think it is impossible for us to wield meaningful political power unless we do that. So it requires, in this country at least. So like, I feel like this incredible difficulty, again, it yields us this like kind of radical opportunity for us to like look within our communities and start having conversations and offering apologies and offering reparations and like making amends in ways that would not be possible in the motherland. You know what I mean? And I had another thought, but all that to say that I acknowledge that it's incredibly difficult and it's incredibly tall order, but I also think that there is like a radical opportunity in the term. And I also think that it is frankly necessary for us to have political power in, to do this.
It's helpful. I promise this wasn't my question. And even though Jonathan knows I'm working on this question specifically in my dissertation research, but we had somebody raise the issue of biracial and mixed race identities, which obviously presses this conversation into a whole new direction, right? Korean American, half Korean, you know, my parents are of different racial identities. So when that comes a part of the mix, obviously we're stretching the terms in a new way. So, you know, what about the tension between the way they are racialized? I would be called an Asian American by, you know, racial categories within, you know, the American political system, and the way race identity that they choose into, and what if those two things don't match? You know, does this call for further destabilization of the term, some expansion of it? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. We need as much destabilization as possible. Right. I mean, the existence of, quote, even the term itself is a clumsy term, biracial, right? Or at least a crude term. Those should help us think what we mean by, you know, say white and Korean, that we need to be less sure about what we think those name or indicate than we are. And I think that's true of intersectional identity. That's what I think intersection is supposed to help us do, is to destabilize categories. I noticed in the Q&A further down, and I want to make sure we get to this, someone asked the question of Native Americans. Same thing, right? And I'm not saying that the substance of race should be black and white. I'm saying the substance of race in America is black and white, and that's exactly the problem. Because I don't think race language is sophisticated enough to get to the histories that we're talking about. It's not sophisticated enough to tell the story genocide of, or the attempted genocide of Native Americans. It's not sophisticated enough to tell the story of, quote, biracial people. It's, as Liz just said, it's not even sophisticated enough to capture what we mean by Asia and Asian American. But we seem both content to acknowledge that and to continue to use the term. That's the difficulty. Liz is raising a very good rejoinder. What other options do we have, especially given what's in front of us? Political necessities that often give us standing precisely because we claim the identity. That, as I think we've tried to say, is one of the million-dollar questions.
I don't have anything to add.
That's helpful. I thought this was an interesting question, especially raised with respect to this idea that Asian American identity was coined for very specific political coalitional purposes. The question really is why? Why does it have to stay that way? Why does it necessarily follow that Asian Americans must stick to mostly or primarily political way of understanding themselves? And what would be wrong with Asian Americans coming together for other, you know, for example, cultural or social reasons?
Because as I said earlier, I don't think it's as easy as that, right? I mean, you can imagine a society where ethnicity, language are deterministic of how people think of one another, how we note and celebrate and honor and also have trouble with difference. That's not the story of this country. I think other countries have working concepts of race, but somehow those concepts are allowed to play with, conflict with, destabilize, introduce other notions of difference. But in America, especially since I think about the 1980s, race difference or race identity has taken up a huge part of the show. And it's not simply that it's removed what we mean by race, the substance of it, and narrowed it substantially, but it's also removed other categories. Like we used to have real strong conceptions and categories of class, but that seems to have given way to questions, right? And frankly, that's one of the big challenges to the Democratic Party, to the left, is how do we have working concepts of race adjacent to concepts of class, especially because given, I'm imagining most of us think this, they're inexhaustibly intertwined with one another. But oftentimes we let one override over the other.
I personally have no problems. I think it's beautiful, like when any community that is marginalized and has a label put on them finds a way to take that label and make it something beautiful and meaningful, and find their own ways to create and finds their own ways to define what that identity means to them. We see that happening in the queer community. We see that happening in Asian America. Like, I think that that's beautiful. And I have personally found a lot of meaning in being Asian American, even though that is an identity that was foisted on me. At the same time, I think for me, the struggle, the only issue that I see with that is when, you know, identifying and gathering around this, you know, the identity of Asian American divorced from the political identity that it was originally intended for. I think then things can get a little bit murky, because I think I feel like creating an insular community that becomes very comfortable and is like maybe fine with the status quo, I think, particularly an Asian American one, then we start to, then I think that's when our communities really become at risk of just becoming props for the status quo as opposed to agitators of it.
Right. Props for the status quo and commodities for the status quo.
Yeah.
Right. And so how do we take those beautiful modes of agency and community where we reclaim that was meant for evil, for good, but also protect it from modes of commodification when they become reduced to modes of capital and consumption. I think that's one of the dangers for us Asian Americans around Crazy Rich Asians, right? We took it as a moment where there was a mode of representation when there previously wasn't, but it was an amazingly thin, commodified conception of Asian and Asian American identity. So again, it's the both and. How do we both acknowledge the extraordinary power and beauty of people's reclaiming terms that have been foisted upon them without living in those and remember, the political economy that created this is not only still present, it's more deeply entrenched, more powerful, more genius, more creative than in the past. So I think those are the kinds of things, you know, that we need to kind of keep in sight.
A couple questions about the way forward. Did have one question, and I think there's a couple others that may tie in here about the fact that, you know, while the black-white binary paradigm of race relations is challenging, it's sort of the world we're living in, right? And so can we move on to the realities you are trying to name, or dealing with the realities you're trying to name, until that's been dealt with? In this particular question, even the issue of reparations is raised, but I think it also gets to the distinction you're making before between deracialization and post-racialization. So maybe saying a little bit more about that could be helpful here.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing you don't want to take away from, you know, what's the insistence of the black-white binary is we need to pay attention to white dominance, white supremacy, and the way it's destroyed everything that's come in front of it. That's what it was created to do. Nor can we take attention away from the dominance and beauty and power of Black agency and Black life. So for that alone, right, it gives us it's tremendously important. I guess I'm asking the question, can we do those things in racial terms while also attending to these other realities? I think that's a really important question. There's a kind of a movement, intellectual movement named Afro-pessimism, and they have very rightly resisted moving away from the black-white binary because they've claimed, I think quite rightly, it's one of the primary ways that gives agency to Black life. So how do we claim that, right? Which is an affordance of racial thinking, or continue to think racially, while also acknowledging the extreme limits for Black people to persistently identify with white people, as if the totality of Black life was simply subsumption under white supremacy, which is a horrendous representation. So how do we do that? While also saying black and white don't name the reality of the history of the land we stand in, right? So that's, I think, some of the enormous challenges confronting us, that we are structured in certain kinds of ways. Those structures afford us certain types of politics, certain types of agency, a modicum of liberation at times, but they're also at the same time extremely delimiting. How do we mark our celebrations, our advances? Well, we're also recognizing that those celebrations, advances exist within a structure that is also keeping us back from other modes of agency, other modes of celebration.
I'm gonna try to combine a few here because I know we're running short on time. Maybe ask one more two-part question. And the second point kind of bringing us home. Racial identity has, for many of us, provided a way of finding community and intimacy and belonging. I think many of the friends that we have, even in this room right now, we've met because of things like PAC or because of other groups within, our different denominations and churches and dioceses. So, how might we then, given what you're saying, Jonathan, in this conversation we've heard today, imagine intimacy, belonging, community, in light of what you said and apart from racial identity? And specifically, I think, so the second part of that question would be, how do we do that as Christians? What might the church have to say, and what might our Christian faith have to, how might that inform that idea?
Let me take the first part of that question, and then I'll kick over the second part of the question to Liz. And we might have some connections back to the Episcopal Church. Neither Liz or I are Episcopalian, but this is important for this context. Yeah, I mean, a couple stories that haunt my theorization is, a very creative person wrote a blog post about being the way these conversations, created a certain kind of need, referred to it in terms of Asian American terms, and then gathered a massive community as an invitation to a common life. I think that's, from my outsider view, that's part of the wonder of PAC. Another story that I think about is a man who grew up in the 80s and who had never had the concept Asian American growing up in high school. And when he got to college and he found a mode of belonging. So again, the question is, how do we acknowledge and celebrate those things when another reality is that for a lot of Asian Americans, it misses too much, that the identity or the distinctions are confining or worse. Right, so how do we do both? And I'm honestly asking the question at this point. I'm not quite sure that we can. And I'm trying to venture other modes of thinking, other modes of identity, other modes of politics, other modes of liberation. I think others think that we can hold both together. And I think that's why Asian Americans need to be having this conversation, because the very fact that we're gathered here today shows that the term does work, or does stuff in the world for us. It gives us standing, but it also, how do we do that and acknowledge the extreme deficits that it has? In terms of the question of the church, let me turn that over to Liz.
I mean, I identify as one of those people who's found incredible meaning and belonging under the Asian American umbrella. So I think for me, when if I were to train a Christian lens on that, I think that's a beautiful thing. I feel like there is so much diversity within Asian America that we are still having to learn and listen and be humble and ask for forgiveness and repent. And we are having to do work out so many of those elements of our life as Christians in this community. And I think at the same time, we shouldn't, being Christian also means that we now have a much more expansive definition of what family means, right? It's not just Asian Americans. And so I think that if we were to stop there at family, we might be missing something. But I feel like identifying as Christian gives us interesting opportunities to be able to expand and think about what we mean when we're talking about our family and who we need to be advocating for and who we should be defending and rooting for. And yeah, so that's my Christian take on the situation.
I mean, I do want to say, I think that the church offers also promise, but also deep complicity on the question of exploitation and broad political economies.
For sure.
Same way that Liz, I think, powerfully articulated what the church can do, or what Christianity can do in terms of acknowledging and celebrating Asian American identities, as well as acknowledging the limitations of it. I think that's the same thing true, right? Because the gospel for the early church thinkers was referred to as the divine economy, and imagines itself posited against the modes of exploitation and domination, that there is a huge strain within Christianity known as liberation theology that goes back to the earliest Gospels, right, and to the readings of Old Testament stories that says what we're about is political liberation, and what God is against is modes of injustice, oppression, domination. How do we link into that and celebrate the gospel of joining, of bringing together, of breaking down boundaries, while also attacking systems of oppression? That's what we believe God has done, and that's what the church is, in a sense, not only assembled to do, but is supposed to embody. If we can live into those, right, in terms of how we imagine money, how we imagine property, how we do labor, how we think about labor, how we think about the dignity of work, then we introduce into the world a real difference. And if we can hang that onto modes of racialized identity, that reimagine, as Liz was saying, from within and explode the categories, then we offer not simply alternative racial identities, we offer an alternative political economy. And I hope that that's, what we can move towards. But I think, as we've seen today, the barriers are significant. But I hope, I almost want to say, if that's not what we're doing, I'm not sure what we're doing, what Christians are doing here.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have time for today. Thank you all again very much for this really stimulating discussion. Felt a little bit like drinking from a fire hydrant at times, but I think we've gotten a lot to think about for a long time. So now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Ishibashi and Peter Huang to kind of bring our program to a close.
Thank you, Jonathan, Liz, and Nate. Yes, as Nate said, I will invite Chris Ishibashi from EAT, Episcopal Asian Supper Table from the Diocese of New York, and Peter Huang from the Gathering, the Diocese of Los Angeles. Chris?
Thank you. Well, I'd first like to say thank you to Liz and Jonathan for a wonderful, stimulating, and provocative conversation. It's given us all a great deal to think about and to pray on. So thank you for the very thoughtful conversation, and thank you to Yein and Nate for your facilitation work to make this event work, and also to the Diocese of Los Angeles for their, specifically Ken and Melissa, for making today work. So thank you all. In my capacity as the planning chair of East, I would like to invite you all to hold a space on your calendar for our next event, which is, we haven't completed the publicity on it, but 2020 has been so far, and it's not over yet. We haven't even gotten to the election, but it's been a punishing year for all of us on so many levels. So on November 21st, we are going to hold an event which blends the spirituality and fellowship, where we can find healing together. It is an opportunity to see old friends and to welcome new ones. and to bring all of what we are. I mean, as one of our members said, you know, I can bring my Asianness to some conversations, but not my faith. And then there are conversations we have with people we know and work with where we can't bring either. So our event on November 21st will be an opportunity for all of us to bring all of who we are to the table, to share with one another and to find healing. So I hope that many of you will join us then, and you're all welcome. And let me turn the floor over to Peter.
Thank you, Chris, and for this partnership between East Episcopal Asian Supper Table and with the gathering, and also with the new community. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to, this COVID pandemic has given us these opportunities to work together virtually and have speakers like Liz and Jonathan join us. So if anything, a bit of silver lining for us to be able to work together. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Jonathan, for the insights that you bring to us. And I do hope that the conversation continues, that there is a deepening of our understanding of race and exploring ways towards racial justice. I do want to acknowledge also and thank our Spanish interpreters, Ara Ramirez and Anabel Garay. Thank you for offering this challenging topic to our Spanish-speaking sisters and brothers. And to our bishops, Bishop Diane Jardine Bruce and Bishop Alan Shin, thank you for your support of our ministries. And a special shout out to the planning team for East and the gathering, and also the new community leadership of the Diocese of Los Angeles. You'll see in the chat that there are opportunities to further engage. The gathering will have a worship event in December, so stay tuned, and we will provide more information on that event. Thank you all for joining us today. It just means a lot to all of us that you're here. And like Chris said, there aren't a lot of spaces where we can be Asian American and Christian and be able to engage in these topics. So thank you for being a part of us. To conclude our time together, I'd like to invite Joyce Suave, who is one of our leaders in the gathering, to close us in prayer. Thank you.
God of righteousness, our hearts are troubled, Lord. We cry out for your transformative power. Propel us from being bystanders into people of activists for justice. Transform us into defiant, irritating pebbles in the shoes of comfortable Christianity. Shake, rattle, and roll us. Turn us upside down so that our mustard seed of faith falls on the earth, made rich with the blood and bones of indigenous and enslaved people. Take that seed, Lord God, and allow the tears of the sorrowful to rain down and cause the mustard to emerge and flourish into branches of comfort for the weary. Thrust us out into the parched fields of the lonely and forgotten. Keep our idle hands busy, weaving together stories of those we meet on the road and not our own. Teach us to be the doulas for the yet unborn dreams of the oppressed and exploited, who are too tired to sleep. Precious Lord, emblazon on our lips the names of Polly Murray, Hosea Williams, and John Lewis, who blazed the trail. Plant our seeds, O Lord, where they might bring about good trouble. Amen.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you all for joining us today. And I hope that we will be able to be in conversation again soon. Thank you. Have a great weekend.